This gate, which was built 600 years ago, is called Zhonghua Gate.
On December 13, 1937, the 6th Division of the Japanese Army blasted this part of the wall and broke into what was then the national capital of Nanjing. Along with other Japanese troops, these soldiers then launched a wild spree of burning, looting, raping, and killing as the event that shocked the world, known as the Nanjing Massacre, unfolded. During this period, over 20 foreigners risked their lives to remain in Nanjing and help protect people any way they could, while also recording the atrocities of the Japanese soldiers. Among them, some of their stories have passed down to the present day and are well known, while others have been buried deep in the dust of history. My name is Andrew David Field. I'm an American historian of China. I've lived in China for many years and have researched this important era in modern Chinese history. In this documentary series, I will take you on a journey to retrace the steps that these foreigners took on the path of history. The choices that they made under great duress leave us with a deeper appreciation of the goodness that lies in human nature, even in the darkest of times. On December 18, 1937, the New York Times ran a rare front-page story about China, All Captives Slain. This was probably the most detailed account of the tragedy published in the Western media during the early days of the Nanjing Massacre. The man who sent in this report was Frank Tillman Durden. Inside the bloody maelstrom of Nanjing, how was he able to send out this report? What other colleagues of his also bore witness to the Japanese atrocities? And what choices would they make in the face of the bayonets and the bloodshed?
1937年12月13日凌晨，侵华日军攻破了南京城，中国国民政府首都沦陷。接下来的几天中，全世界都听不到来自南京的声音。也看不到发自南京的报道。中国国民政府的首都似乎一下子从地球上消失了。其实，当时留在南京还有5名西方记者，他们是英国路透社记者史密斯、美国芝加哥每日新闻报记者斯蒂尔、美国派拉蒙电影公司记者门肯、美联社记者麦克丹尼尔，以及美国《纽约时报》记者德丁。此时的德丁还只是他们中的一名新手。
These are young people. They have not necessarily seen that much of the world. Testing themselves, of being involved in the world, of being there where history is made. There was a real sense of wanting to be in the middle of things when history was happening, and of wanting to be on the side of the good people and not the evil people.
自1937年7月7日中国全国抗日战争爆发以来，南京已成为中国国民政府指挥抗战的大本营。西方的新闻机构蜂拥而至，南京的外国记者成为历史上最多的一次。刚刚被《纽约时报》雇佣的德丁也在其中。9月20日，淞沪会战正处于焦灼状态，日本军方为配合上海方面的进攻，又一次出动了50架飞机，对南京进行持续3个小时的轰炸。这促使了德丁在南京第1篇报道的诞生。德丁在这篇报道中写道：日方宣布 从今天中午开始，可能对任何地区发动不加区别的、更加猛。这张照片拍摄于德丁到达南京的2个月后，德丁已经以他出色的报道，跻身于能和蒋介石合影的众多资深记者的行列。就在拍摄这张照片的1个月后，上海沦陷，侵华日军占领上海后，立即挥刀指向中国国民政府的首都。南京顷刻间成为一座危城。就在大量难民如洪水般纷纷逃离南京时，另一位美国记者却选择了逆流而上，从山东济南出发，一路南下，终于在12月2日赶到战云密布的南京。这个人是芝加哥每日新闻报的记者阿奇包德·斯蒂尔。到达南京的当天，斯蒂尔就奔赴战场前线，发出了战场通讯。1937年12月5日，斯蒂尔到达南京的3天后，侵华日军已攻至距南京城约30多公里的汤山、江宁一带，战斗极其激烈而残酷。德丁在汤山战场上亲眼目睹了一场悲壮的血战，300名中国军人被日军围困在山顶，密集的炮火、机枪火力将每一个人置于死地。经昨天一整天激战，全体士兵几乎无一生还。这一组德丁收藏的照片，再现了当年战场的残酷。这一天是12月8日，距日军破城还有5天。
This is the gate through which the citizens of Nanjing had to pass if they wanted to get to the Yangtze River. While Durden was reporting from outside the city walls, the soldiers were fortifying the gate with cement and sandbags. Therefore, if people wanted to get outside of the city, they had to climb down from atop the city wall.
12月9日，距日军破城还有4天。此时，几个月前蜂拥而至的外国记者们，大多数都已听从本国使馆的建议撤离了。南京城内只剩下德丁、斯蒂尔等5名外国记者在坚持报道战况。12月10日。距日军破城还有3天。这一天，斯蒂尔在报道中描述了南京城内的境况。南京最艰难的时刻来临了，1天的轰炸、扫射，将数以百计血肉模糊、肢体破碎的人送进医院。他们痛苦的呻吟将长久萦绕在我的记忆里。12月11日，距日军破城还有不到2天。这一天，德丁在街头似乎感觉到了一股血腥的气息。他在报道中写道：“某种歇斯底里的情绪在中国城防部队里显现出来，大家都懂得，大多数人已被困住。 都要牺牲。一小股士兵刚刚在街角竖好路障，他们庄严地围成一圈，宣誓与阵地共存亡。南京战役无疑将作为现代军事编年史上最悲惨的一页而载入史册。12月12日，日军破城前的最后一天。这一天，德丁来到长江边查看。一江门今天上午重新开放，但傍晚时分，该城门再次关闭。江面上几乎见不到一艘船，这可是撤离的唯一路线呢。这篇报道是德丁在日军破城前最后一次和外界的联系。此后几天里，留在南京城内的5名记者都和外界失去了联系。日军攻破南京城后，随即就开始了惨绝人寰的大屠杀。为封锁消息，日本军方切断了南京与外界的所有电讯联系。自南京被占领后，日本国内的各大报纸多数都在庆祝南京的陷落和粉饰太平。《纽约时报》却在12月15日以粗大的标题发出“南京的沉没令上海害怕”的报道。中国首都的守军和平民伤亡巨大，这2天来一点消息也没有。滞留在南京城内平民和美国人的命运令人难以预料。
For the 5 reporters who remained in Nanjing, the only way to get the news out was to leave Nanjing. On December 15, just 3 days after the invasion of the city, Durden and 4 other reporters left Nanjing aboard the USS Oahu, an American gunboat bound for Shanghai. The day afterwards, the last remaining reporter, McDaniel for the Associated Press, left Nanjing aboard the Japanese destroyer Tsuga.
12月15日，南京城破获的第3天，德丁等4名记者带着尚未发出的新闻稿、一些信件和报告，匆匆赶往码头。前往码头的路并不顺畅，他们一路上不得不绕开被尸体堵塞的街道。当4位记者开车经过临近下关码头的一江门时，被意外地阻住了去路。德丁看到，城门处中国人的尸体堆积有6英尺之高，日军的重型军车穿行于此，碾压在尸骸之上，车轮在尸骨上疯狂地打滑。这座城门曾经是中国军队的逃生通道。自从城门封闭后，这里聚集了大量试图逃往江边的中国守军。德丁在后来的报道里记载，日军攻占一江门的同时，就开始大肆屠杀中国守军。3天后，日军还没有把尸体搬走。日本人似乎想让恐怖的景象尽可能长久地留住，好让中国人牢记抵抗日军的可怕后果。当德丁一行4人艰难地穿越这堆尸骨抵达码头时，更令他们震惊的一幕发生了。
And the scene on the riverfront, as I waited for the launch to the Oahu, was of a group of smoking, chatting Japanese officers overseeing the massacring of a battalion of Chinese captive troops. They were marching them out in groups of about 50 and machine gunning them.
德丁在后来的报道里记载，这场屠杀用了10分钟，这些人靠墙排成一排被枪杀，一些拿着手枪的日本兵若无其事地从蜷缩在一起的尸体旁走过，对还在动弹的遇难者再补上一枪。这些刽子手还邀请停在江边军舰上的海军欣赏屠杀场面。显然，这种场面给那些海军观赏者带来极大的愉悦。这场血腥屠杀是德丁等4名记者在南京最后时刻见证到的暴行。美联社记者麦克丹尼尔比瓦福号上的4位记者晚了1天离开南京。他在给芝加哥每日论坛报的报道中说：“我对南京最后的记忆是，死难的中国人，死难的中国人，还是死难的中国人。”在驶往上海的美国军舰瓦湖号上，斯蒂尔向芝加哥每日新闻发出了题为“日军杀人成千上万”的报道，这也是西方媒体最早关于南京大屠杀这一事件的报道。德丁也想在瓦湖号上发出报道，但他没有成功。1992年，德丁在一次采访中透露，那时候我年轻又是个新手，而斯蒂尔则是位行家。他确实发出了他的报道。1937年12月18日，《纽约时报》将德丁从上海发来的报道“所有俘虏均遭屠杀”刊登在头版。这篇报道详细记录了日军在南京大屠杀前期所犯下的暴行。在这篇报道的最后，德丁写道：“在日本人的统治下，受到惊吓的人们生活在面临死亡、折磨和抢劫的恐惧中。数万中国军人的坟墓将会是中国人反抗日本征服的全部希望所在。”
On December 13, 1937, the Japanese army broke through the city walls of Nanjing. On December 15, Durden left Nanjing. During this 3-day period, just what happened in the city of Nanjing? What sort of horrific events did the American and British journalists witness? Now, let us turn back the clock to December 13, 1937, in order to find out just what happened in Nanjing.
1937年12月13日凌晨，驻守南京的中国军队溃败之际，斯蒂尔和麦克丹尼尔正在美国大使馆内。当中国军队从使馆后面跑步向下关方向溃败时，他们才逐渐相信南京城被攻破这一事实。留在城内的5名外国记者开始分头行动。美联社记者麦克丹尼尔刚刚抵达城北城墙附近，他在报道里写道：“日本兵举着枪向我冲来时，我举双手从车子里出来。经日军同意，我爬过残破的城门，穿行在布满中国军人尸体的街上。但是城门口的一幕，却让麦克丹尼尔极度震惊。他在报道里写道：被砍下的中国人的头颅放在路障上，嘴里放了块饼干，另一个嘴里 插了支长长的中国烟斗。
In this January 10, 1938 issue of Life magazine, there is a photo showing the severed head of a Chinese man whose head was undoubtedly chopped off by a Japanese soldier and placed upon this barbed wire barricade. And inside the mouth of the severed head, an object has been wedged. It isn't hard to discover that this image and the scene that McDaniel witnessed from the city gate are indeed very similar. The only real difference is the object wedged inside the mouth of the dead person. We can't say for sure whether McDaniel actually took this photo, but we can say with certainty that this horrific scene occurred in Nanjing.
当麦克丹尼尔在北门记录这恐怖的一幕时，远在南门的斯蒂尔正亲眼目睹了一场集体屠杀。他在报道里写道：“一群几百个行将处死的人，被迫扛着一面大幅的日本旗穿街而过。他们被赶入一块空地枪杀。一名日本兵站在越积越多的尸体堆上，用步枪补射仍在动弹的躯体。对日军来说，这可能是战争；然而对我，却像谋杀。”斯蒂尔笔下的屠杀场景，是日本军方极力想掩饰的暴行。这段影像来自于日军随军记者白井茂在南京沦陷后拍摄的影片。片中的南京城呈现出一片和平景象，但是白井茂在后来的回忆录中却这样写道：“我不可能将所有看到的都拍下来。即使拍下来，也会被剪掉。”影片中几个被日军清理过的城门，曾经是德丁等记者在日军破城后采访过的地方。但是，影片里唯独缺少了南京城南的中华门。这些被日本大阪每日新闻社悄悄保存下来的不许可照片，曾经被日本军方严令销毁。其中一张照片还原了当年中华门里的惨状。斯蒂尔在报道中写道：“在南门映入我眼帘的是一片肆意屠杀的场景。上千名军人以各种可能的姿态被屠杀，到处是烧焦的残骸。”此时，在市中心采访的德丁，则在数小时内亲眼目睹了3起集体屠杀。他在报道里写道：“很多人被抓后当场被杀，他们中有老人、有妇女，还有儿童。很多人都是被刺刀捅死。从伤口处可以看出，有的死者是被极其野蛮、极端残忍地杀害的。”德丁的这篇报道发表的第2天，《纽约时报》专门发表了评论文章。德丁的报道读起来，就像发生在几百年前的战争故事。德丁先生的报道表达了一个现场观察家的观点：通过掠夺这座城市和居民，日本人已经加深了中国人被压抑的仇恨。这种仇恨将以各种形式在中国人的胸中慢慢燃烧，经久不衰。
2 days after this report was published, the New York Times published another of Durden's reports. This report was titled, "Foreigners' Role in Nanking Praised," and in the report were these lines: "Their lives often jeopardized by the shelling and bombing and by unruly soldiers, a small group of foreigners who stayed throughout the Japanese siege of Nanking, within the walls of the city, occupied unique roles of great humanitarian, and political importance.
这20多位外国人，在1937年11月22日，成立了南京安全区国际委员会。他们在南京大屠杀期间，保护了成千上万平民的生命，并通过日记、书信等方式，记载了日军在南京所犯下的暴行。5位西方记者从南京撤离时，将其中一些外国人的书信、新闻稿等材料带到了上海。其中，金陵大学历史系教授贝德士所撰写的一篇名为《南京一瞥》的新闻稿，引起了英国《曼彻斯特卫报》驻上海记者田伯烈的注意。此后，田伯烈和贝德士建立了长期的联系。1938年7月，在贝德士等人的帮助下，田伯烈撰写出《外人目睹中之日军暴行》一书，在汉口出版。南京陷落后，武汉已成为中国国民政府的政治、经济、军事重镇。日军占领南京后，并没有停下进攻的步伐。此时的武汉成为了双方军事较量的战场。这一组德丁收藏的照片，就是拍摄于这一时期。自德丁离开南京后，很快就转战重庆、汉口一带。此时的他已将视线聚焦至整个中国抗日战场。他在报道中写道：“和南京陷落前的那段日子相比，民众的抗日热情更为高涨。中国人民身上具有一种令人惊异的承受苦难的能力，一种在日军侵略带来的种种恐怖面前也不失自身士气的能力。”
These reports would have helped, but at least it told Americans that they couldn't simply turn away, that this was going to be a conflict that would involve them as well as the other countries.
1945年8月15日，日本天皇发表了终战诏书，宣布无条件投降。中国人民抗日战争最终取得了胜利。中国国民政府决定把中国战区受降签字仪式的地牺牲日军统治。
side by side with Tilman Durden. At times he shared his findings and information and so on with other correspondents. He was a correspondent of the highest quality and commitment. I think he had a great deal of impact upon him.
The Japanese asked us to come to Hiroshima. And then Top stood up, but then they came to a meeting afterwards asking us what we thought of all this terrible things that had happened. And Top stood up and he said, well, this is a horrible, horrible thing that has happened in Hiroshima, but there's not one mention of why it started or who started it. And he said, this can't compare to the rape of Nanking.
德丁的报道不仅仅影响着身边的同事，重要的是，在南京大屠杀初期，为历史留下了非常珍贵的第一手资料。通过《纽约时报》的影响力，向西方世界揭露了侵华日军的残暴本性，对南京人民遭受的苦难给予深切的同情。德丁对南京大屠杀的系列报道，在西方世界揭露了侵华日军法西斯暴行的真面目，具有深远的意义。1971年，中美关系解冻后，德丁成为首批获准进入中国内地采访的美国记者之一。1985年，受到邓小平的接见。1988年6月，德丁又一次重回故地南京，参观了侵华日军南京大屠杀遇难同胞纪念馆。随后，在美国的圣地亚哥联盟论坛报上发表参观感言。这个新博物馆的建立，表示了中国政府并没有忘记这段历史，但是部分日本官员和右翼群体却否认这段历史，一次次的洗刷罪行，甚至不承认日本侵华的事实。这篇报道是德丁最后一次正式在报纸上发表有关南京大屠杀的文章。1998年，德丁在美国圣地亚哥去世。
On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. Later that month, the New York Times published an editorial, Remember Nanking. Inside this editorial is a quote from an original report by Frank Durden on the Nanjing Massacre in December 1937. The editorial concludes, Nanking is only one of many crimes for which the Japanese must answer, but it is one of the worst. It is a crime no living Japanese army man should be permitted to forget. The United States used more than one slogan in prosecuting the war against Japan. We were asked to remember Pearl Harbor, then it was remember Bataan. The Chinese could have had half 100, but they needed only one. That was remember Nanking.